welcome to Financial Insider Weekly. I'm your host, Michael Gray, CPA. My guest today is Mary Russell, and Mary is an attorney. She has her own law firm that she calls Stock Option Counsel, and Mary serves as the Stock Option Counsel to individual employees and founders on their stock options and other startup stock. This service applies her experience as a corporate attorney at Wilson Sonsini in startup financings, mergers, and IPOs to help individuals who are negotiating their stock options and salaries, making exercise and tax decisions, and selling their startup stock. Mary started her career as a middle school social studies teacher in Tulsa, Oklahoma, went on to law school at the University of Iowa, where she discovered the fascinating world of tax law, and worked as a research assistant to her tax professor, whose name was Larry Ward. She blogs on her Stock Option Counsel website to educate employees and founders on their stock options and other startup stock, and she's now adding video blogs as well, including video on negotiating the right startup salary and equity. Now, as we get started, we're going to be talking about an introduction to employee stock option basics. And I want to caution our viewers that this is just an introduction to a complex topic. We're probably not going to even cover all the points that we have here. We want you to seek advice from a tax advisor, attorney, or investment advisor, preferably one that specializes in Silicon Valley startup stock. In addition, I wanted to remind our viewers, I have some books on this. So I have a book called Secrets of Tax Planning for Employee Stock Options. It's what I call the big book. That's going to be coming out here shortly. And then I have another Executive Tax Planning for Employee Stock Options book that's designed more for employees, a little more abbreviated information. Mary, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for your books.
You're welcome. Okay, Mary, why did you get involved in advising people with employee stock options?
Well, it came out of conversations with friends I have who are employees of startups. It's a very popular kind of job to have among people my age. And when I was listening to them talk about their stock options, it was clear to me that they didn't have the information that they needed to make really good decisions about negotiating their job offers and how many shares they would get, or making exercise and tax decisions, or selling their shares. I came from the perspective of being in a big law firm and doing all sorts of deals that had to do with stock options. So I knew them from the inside out. So I saw that kind of misalignment of information, or lack of information that the employees had, and I thought it'd be great if I could use my knowledge to help individuals make the right choices.
Great. Well, why don't you explain just what is an employee stock option?
So I focus on private companies, so I'll keep this discussion related to anything before an initial public offering. Anything that happens before the stock would be traded in a way that anyone in the public could buy it. So before that happens, the public doesn't have access to investing in these companies. Like, everyone talks about the IPO. It's such a big deal because the public can buy the stock.
Right.
Before that, it's a private company. Outside individuals don't have access to it. So a stock option is a right for a person to purchase stock in the company. It's very special because you have access that somebody else doesn't have because you're an employee at the company. So you're granted, they call it, a right to buy stock in the company at a set price. So for instance, they'll say you can buy 10,000 shares of stock in the company for $1 a share. And you'll have that right for a certain amount of time. And the exercise price, or the price you pay per share of stock, doesn't change over that amount of time when you have the option. So that's the benefit. You get a right to buy stock in a company that you wouldn't otherwise be able to invest in at a set price that doesn't change over time. So even as the value of the stock goes up, or let's say the company goes public and it's now trading at $10 a share on NASDAQ, you can still buy the share for $1 a share. So that's the stock option.
Okay. So maybe you can talk a little bit about vesting.
Oh, okay. So another element of a grant to an employee of a stock option is that you don't fully own that right on the day it's granted. It vests over time, meaning you vest or receive your rights to that over time. So the standard in Silicon Valley is 4-year vesting. So you, on day one, when you're granted the stock, you're able to exercise, or you have full ownership in 0 options. After 4 years, you have ownership or full rights to the full grant. So back to our example, 10,000 options. And so that's the 4-year vesting.
Right.
The 1-year cliff means that you don't vest any shares until the 1-year anniversary of your grant. After that, you vest monthly. So you vest 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 for the first year, and then at that 1-year anniversary, you vest or become entitled to or own 1/4 of the full grant. And after that, you vest monthly, so a little more, a little more, a little more, a little, until the 4th year when you own the full amount.
Right. So I don't know if we've got any other questions. What happens when you leave?
What happens when you leave? This is a great question. First of all, because it's different with every company.
Yes.
And second of all, because there's a lot of money at stake.
Yes.
If you leave the company and you don't exercise your stock options within the set amount of time, your options expire. In most cases, now look at your documents or talk to HR, whatever you need to do, but in most cases it's 90 days after your termination date, so after your last day of working there. That's when your rights go away. You can no longer exercise. So this is a really important window. If you haven't exercised your stock options, meaning put up the money and purchase the stock before that amount of time, your rights disappear. So if at the time you leave you have a right to purchase 10,000 shares at $1 a share, and those shares are now worth $100,000, for instance, and you choose not to exercise, you forfeit that value in, or that increase in value of those shares simply by not exercising.
Right.
So people come to me and they ask about that. They come to someone like you and ask, what are the tax consequences of exercising at this moment? And so there's a lot of important details there, like alternative minimum tax and other issues that you're going to want to look at that time.
Okay. So I think I'll mention a situation that I had. So part of the reason why people come to Mary is that they're very unhappy about how some of these things work out. And I had one situation, this person had not read their option, and basically their option lapsed on termination. So she didn't have 90 days after, or any period after. If she had not exercised her options at termination, then she lost them. And she didn't know this, and she terminated. And so that was a very unhappy circumstance. I tell you this story, folks, because there are an awful lot of people. A big issue with employee stock options is just that employees are very busy people, particularly when they're working for tech companies. Some of these are people that may be almost working 24 hours a day on some projects. They're virtually sleeping at the companies that they're working at in these early days, trying to get startups off the ground. And so they're so busy that they don't have time to take care of their own affairs, and they're not reading these agreements. It's a little bit like, you go and you buy a car, and they put this big contract in front of you and say, you've got to sign here to take this car home. And you say, okay, that's what I have to do. So you sign the agreement, and you take the car home, and you hope everything's okay because you haven't read all that fine print. Well, it's the same thing with a stock option agreement. There's a lot of fine print to it. And there are some guidelines. There are things in, for example, the Internal Revenue Code that says how these plans are supposed to work. But the employer can go inside of those guidelines. So, for example, an incentive stock option, you're required to have been an employee within 90 days in order for it to qualify, within 90 days of the exercise of the option, in order for it to qualify as an incentive stock option. So some employers use that guideline to say, okay, 90 days after you leave, it's expired. Some employers will say, no, it's going to expire before that. Some employers even allow you to keep the option, but it converts to being a non-qualified stock option. So there's a big range of what companies do with these plans. And so it behooves you to spend time studying, or if nothing else, give it to somebody else and have them explain it to you how this thing works. Okay.
Yeah, I can follow up on that. So one thing that's unusual about my practice is that I'm very accessible. I have a lot of clients who just come to me in a quick, a quick situation. I have these documents. I need to know what they mean by the end of the week, because I need to know what my rights are. Am I going to leave the company, or whatever the situation is? So don't hesitate to reach out. I hate to give a plug here, but it really is a special part of my service that we're available for these questions. Mm-hmm. Another item on your question about what happens when you leave, there's a little nuance here that can come up in the documents, and people don't expect this, and it can make a huge difference as to the value of your options or your shares. And that is if the company has a right to repurchase your shares from you when you leave the company. So if you leave the company when the shares are worth, let's say, $2 a share, and you exercise at $1 a share, okay, well, you have $1 per share built-in value there. Okay, that's great. But it's in your best interest to hold on to those shares rather than sell them back to the company at, let's say, $2 a share. You want to be holding those shares over time while the value goes up, up, up. Ideally, sometimes it doesn't go up, but you want to be holding those shares. So if the company has the right to buy them back from you, that's something you want to know when you're working there and you're thinking about the value of your options, and also when you're leaving if you're deciding to exercise. So that's another one of those fine print pieces that comes up that's important to know if you're leaving the company.
Yeah. Well, since we're talking about private company stock and we're talking about when people leave, so I think I'll just put this on the table at this point before we move on, and that is, this is a huge decision area. This is not a thing to be taken lightly as far as what's going to happen when you leave. There are usually tax consequences that we may or may not have time to get into much detail about related to these options. And so that's why you need to consult with a tax advisor to be sure that you know what you're getting yourself into. What I mean is, you can exercise an option for private company stock, and you're going to have maybe a big tax bill that you may not have the money to pay. And so what I've always told people is that you don't want to put yourself in financial distress. In some cases, people actually have to walk away from these things, and it's heartbreaking. But you need to look at what you're getting into. These companies are high-risk investments, and they represent a huge value. In some cases, this is the person's major asset. So again, it behooves you to invest a little bit to get the help in making a good decision before you get yourself into trouble. You want to maybe make any more comments beyond what I just said?
There's a lot there. I mean, I spend my days in these weeds with people. But there's important choices to be made, and tax is involved, and investment risk is involved, and legal details are involved. at the time you receive your stock options from the company. So when you're negotiating, all right, am I going to get this salary and this number of options, and are they going to be ISOs or NSOs or restricted stock units? I mean, there's a lot of important details there and choices to be made. And then the big drama with the AMT, like you're talking about, comes up at the exercise. And then there's also, when you sell the shares, there is some secondary market activity now, people selling private company stock. And so there's tax consequences there as well. It's a big difference for selling your shares. I don't want to get too far in the details on that. Let's say a year after you exercise them versus 6 months after you exercise them. So just paying attention to that, knowing what your opportunities are, but also knowing what the consequences are going to be.
Okay. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how a stock option fits in the company's story and stock history. I think that was sort of an interesting point that you sort of raised.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to talk about something that's way off topic, but I find that it's people who know how startups work and how the capitalization or the stock sales go in a startup have a better feel for, or are better able to grasp the details of the number of shares and the tax treatment. I think it's helpful for people. So if I could take a few minutes and just tell you how a startup works as far as its stock. Okay. Does that sound okay?
Go ahead.
Okay. So we start out and there's, let's say, 2 people, and they have a company idea, they have a business idea or a technology idea, and they want to get started. So they create a corporation. What does this mean, right? You create a corporation by going to a state office or having someone go to the state office and filing paperwork, and then you have a corporation. At that point, no one owns the company, and the company owns nothing. It's just a shell.
Okay.
So the founders of a company, these are the owners, the people who start the company, they first of all, they issue stock to themselves. So at the end of that event, let's say it's half and half. I own half, you own half if we're the founders.
Yes.
But what does the company own at that point? So the founders are going to assign all of their work in the company to, or in the business, to the company. So if they have patents, if they have business plans, if they're already making money and revenue, that all comes into the corporation. So they each own half of this thing that owns what they've assigned to it.
Okay.
So then that goes forward, and more effort is put into the company. It owns more intellectual property or revenue coming in or whatever it is. And then they continue to divide the company as more people get involved and they want stock in the company. So one thing that they might do is go out, in typical Silicon Valley, they go out and they get investment from angel investors, from venture capitalists, the big names, Sequoia, Excel. They go out and they get funding. So they sell a portion of the company to an outside investor, and so they get stock, and then more money comes into the company. So there's ideas, there's patents, there's other IP, and now there's money in the company. And these investors take stock. So the founders own what's usually common stock. It's also known as founders stock. And these investors, if they're at the stage of selling to venture capitalists, they will receive preferred stock in the company. It's preferred, meaning it has special rights. For instance, they might have the right to dividends, to profits or dollars going out to them over time, whereas the other common stockholders wouldn't have that right. They might get extra money if the company is acquired. This preference, they might get their investment back before anyone else is paid for their shares. So these investors have special rights or preferences. So they own a portion of the company, the founders own the rest. Then, this is important for stock options, they're going to take, let's say, 10 or 15% of the company and reserve it for issuance to employees as stock options. This is called the incentive pool or the option pool. They're just reserved, they're set aside. So if you come into the company and you're the first employee after a financing, you're going to get a certain percentage of the company. a number of shares. So if they come in and if you come in and they say, okay, you're going to get 10,000 or options to purchase 10,000 shares. The first question you should ask in your head and then to the company is, okay, 10,000 of what? How many are there? Who has them? How is this going to look later down the line when more investment dollars come out and more shares are sold and my portion of the company, my 10,000 shares, is diluted or made smaller by more investment coming in? Right? So you can kind of see the story of the company. So you're issued your options out of this pool, and then others are issued their options out of this pool. And I could talk all day about what happens next, but then there's more venture capital investment comes in. What you used to have, which might be, what you have, which might have been 1% of the company, is now 0.5% of the company as more stock is sold to investors and issued to other employees. So that's kind of the story of the startup. And then hopefully, and most startups,
they don't work out. They just go out of business.
Exactly. And so your 1%
nothing.
was lovely, and then it was nothing. But, in other cases, a company is acquired, like an Instagram. The company is sold for $1 billion, and everyone who had a piece of that company gets paid out, whether it's in cash, if the company is purchased for cash, or stock in the company that acquires the company, or the company goes public, has an IPO, the Twitters of the world, and then you have a share of stock, which is still a share of stock, but now you have a market for that. You can sell it easily to, the public market.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that was a good story. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
I hope people can sort of visualize, a little bit of that process. So time is going. But I want to hit, just some real basics related to some of the different equity compensations that we're talking about. So we've got, first of all, a non-qualified option. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what are some of the characteristics of that.
Okay. I don't know how far to go back in tax land,
Okay.
but so the traditional relationship between an employer, employee, and the Internal Revenue Service is that anytime the employer gives something to the employee, then that's a taxable event, right? If you pay me $100, the IRS is going to say that's a taxable event. I want a portion of that. So there's special rules in the tax code that encourage employers to grant stock options as a form of compensation. And so they defer taxation on that event until a later time. And that's great. But if that doesn't apply, you should assume that if the company is not following these special rules, then it will be a taxable event. So you're going to owe taxes when you receive something from the company. So a non-qualified stock option is, it's not qualified for the ISO rules which give that special tax treatment.
Okay. So, in essence, in a summary, folks, real quick, because the time is going, a non-qualified stock option, what happens is that there is no tax event when the company grants the stock option, because it's considered as not really, you don't know what the value is at that point, because there's no market for the option itself. It's not traded. When the option is exercised, then at that point, the excess of the fair market value of the stock that's received over the option price, provided it's vested, is currently taxable, and it's added to your wages, and it's subject to employment taxes, and it's taxed as ordinary income. Okay, it's not something that's eligible for offset, for example, by capital losses. It's not a capital gain type transaction. This is, again, like wages or a bonus in a sense. It's almost as if the company gave you a bonus of cash, and then you use that money to buy the stock. Okay. Now, incentive stock options.
Incentive stock options
Yes.
That's a provision in the tax code that provides special treatment, tax deferral treatment for stock options. So if you qualify as an ISO, if the option is granted with an exercise price equal to the fair market value on the date of grant, then you don't have any income at the grant date. And then when you exercise that option, you receive, if you have a gain there, you don't have to, meaning the value of the stock is more than your exercise price. That's a benefit to you that you're receiving, in essence, from the company. So without these special ISO rules, you'd be taxed on that. But under the ISO rules, you're deferred, your tax on that is deferred until you sell the stock, except for the AMT. Do you want to go on about that?
Okay. So there is a second tax system that we have. Now we've got multiple tax systems. It's growing. But anyway, but we have the alternative minimum tax. It's another way of figuring a tax. It's sort of a flat tax, and you have to pick up this income that you otherwise would have reported if it was a non-qualified stock option. When you exercise an incentive stock option, that is income on this alternative minimum tax schedule. And so we don't have time to go into all the details, but it can be a big tax bill. And sometimes it's a surprise because people say, well, wait, I got an incentive stock option. I don't have to pay the tax until I sell the stock. Well, it doesn't necessarily work that way because of this alternative minimum tax. Another thing is there's a holding period rule that applies and how the gain is going to be taxed. So if you hold the stock for more than 2 years after the grant date and 2 years after the exercise date, then all of the gain on the regular tax schedule will be taxed as long-term capital gain. So it converts that gain over to a different type of income. And you're hoping that that's going to be a tax benefit. It's a little problematic because of this alternative minimum tax. Folks, believe it or not, we're about out of time. So we've hit a few highlights, just enough to whet your appetite, get some advice, find some good books on this subject, look at some of our other recordings, and we'll see you next. Oh, Mary, thanks for coming.
My pleasure.
Thanks for being my guest. Folks, we'll see you next time on Financial Insider Weekly.